Good morning, friends. We are going to read an outline history of English literature by William Henry Hudson. The preface says that learning about the history of English literature and the social background of social background of England, both are very important to learn or understand literary works. So here in the contents we have introduction, English literature before Chaucer 500 to 1340, the age of Chaucer, from Chaucer to Tortoise Miscellany, and so on. So today we are going to read about the introduction, English literature before Chaucer. So I'll try to read for nearly 1 or 2 hours, as much as I could complete till Chaucer. So let's begin. And this is chapter 1, introductory part. What is a history of English literature? Perhaps it seems hardly worthwhile to put this question because the answer to it is so very obvious. A history of English literature, we reply without a moment's hesitation, is simply a chronological account of the books which have been written in the English language, and since we cannot think of a book without thinking also of its author, of the men who wrote them. In a rough way, this answer is all right so far as it goes, but it is too vague and it does not go far enough. It will be well for us, therefore, to pause at the outset of our own work to consider a little closely what it is that a history of English literature, however brief, really involves. Stress may first of all be laid upon the personal element in it, which our answer already recognizes. We cannot, we say, think of a book without thinking also of its author. Every book, in other words, takes us back immediately to the man behind it, and whose genius it is a product, and whose thoughts and feelings it embodies. In a history of English literature, therefore, we must fix attention upon the personalities of the men by whom this literature has been made. In a short sketch, we cannot, of course, examine in detail their lives, experiences, and characters. This must be left for a more extended study. But we must try nonetheless to understand the distinctive quality in the genius of each man who comes before us. The reason of this is clear. Genius means many things, but at bottom it means strength of personality and as a consequence what we call originality. Every great writer, it has been well said, brings one absolutely new thing into the world himself, and it is just because he puts this one new thing into what he writes that his work bears its own special hallmark and has something about it which makes it unlike the work done by anyone else. In the detailed study of any great writer, this essential element of individuality is the chief feature to be considered, and in an historical survey, no matter how slight, it must be carefully noted too, for otherwise we cannot learn why such a writer counts as he does in the literature of his nation. A history of English literature, then, is concerned to indicate the nature and value of the particular contribution which each writer personally has made to that literature. This, however, is only a small part of its task. A mere list of authors taken separately and of their books does not constitute a history of literature, for literature as a whole grows and changes from generation to generation, and in tracing this growth, history must show the place which each writer occupies in it and his relations with those who went before and with those who came after him. A writer of exceptionally powerful personality is certain to stamp his impress upon his age, and amongst those who follow him, many will always be found who, whether they are conscious of it or not, reveal his influence in their thought and style. Moreover, the popularity obtained by any writer with a particular kind of work will naturally breed imitations, and what has once been done successfully will for a time be done again and again. In this way, schools are formed and movements initiated, which last for a while, and then, when tastes presently change and other schools and movements arise, disappear. Thus, we speak of the school of Pope, meaning the whole succession of poets who wrote in the particular style which he had brought to perfection and made current. Of the classic movement in verse which, following his lead, these writers carried on, of the romantic movement in prose fiction which owed its principal impulse to Scott's historical novels, and so on. Such schools and movements always play a large part in the development of literature and are often as important to the student as the individual writers themselves. It must be remembered too that even the most original men, the men who are most completely themselves, their intellectual ancestry and are often deeply indebted to others for inspiration and example. I have just spoken of Pope's particular style, but this was not his own independent creation, and while it assumed perfection in his hands, it is really the final result of a long movement in verse which had already found great representative in his immediate predecessor, Dryden. Scott was educated in a romantic school before he became, in his turn, a supreme master in that school. We frequently think of Shakespeare as if he stood altogether apart in the literature of his day, but in fact he took the drama up at the point which it had reached when he began to write for the stage and followed the lines which his forerunners had laid down. The history of literature then must take account of all these things. It must bring out the relationships between writer and group and group. It must trace the rise, growth, and decline of schools and movements, and whenever any given writer had been specially prominent in their evolution, it must consider the influence he exerted in making literature, either by keeping it in the old channels or in directing it into new, new wine in the old bottle. Oh, sorry, old wine in the new bottle. Old wine in the new bottle. We have, however, to go much farther even than this. I have said that literature as a whole grows and changes from generation to generation. This means that as each age has its own particular lines of interest and its own particular way of thinking and feeling about things, so the literature which it produces is governed by certain prevailing tastes, that these tastes last for a time only, and that the tastes of one age are sure to differ and are often found to differ enormously from those of every other. near as we are to the great Victorian era, which was simply the era of our fathers. There is much in its literature which now seems as foreign to us as its fashions and dress. We all know that authors did not write and that there was no public to enjoy the same kind of poetry in Pope's day as in Spencer's, or in Scott's day as in Pope's. In Spencer's day, there was boundless enthusiasm for the fairy queen. In Pope's, for the essay on man. In Scott's, for the lady of the lake. Now, the great central purpose of a history of literature the purpose to which everything else in it is secondary and subordinate is to give a clear account of the whole transformation of literature from period to period, and so far as possible to make out the causes which have combined to produce it. Among these causes, as I have already suggested, we have to reckon the influence of individual men, for a great will often create a new taste and make a fresh departure in the literature of his time. Yet, while full weight must be given to personal initiative and example, we must be careful not to emphasize their importance to the exclusion of all other considerations. Even the greatest genius is necessarily molded by the culture, ideals, and mental and moral tendencies of the world into which he is born, and the character of what he produces is therefore to a large extent determined by these. If a man of powerful personality stamps his impress upon his age, as I have said, he also takes the impress of his age and the success of his work, entirely original as it may seem to be, is often due to the way in which it meets or anticipates the general taste of the public to which he appeals. In this sense, we have to regard every writer as a product of his time, and so regarding him, we have to inquire into the nature of the influences which shaped his thought, directed his taste, and helped to give a distinctive character to his work. Such inquiry, it is evident, will often lead us rather far afield. Sometimes the influences in question are purely literary, that is, they belong to the sphere of books and scholarship. Thus, for example, one of the principal forces behind in the English literature of the Elizabethan era was the immense enthusiasm of the Greek and Latin classics, which had come with what we call the Renaissance. Our writers and the readers alike were under the powerful spell of Italian literature during the same period under that of French literature at the